Good afternoon. The first item of business this afternoon is point of order. Megan Gallagher.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I seek your guidance today. Given the Scottish Government's shoddy behaviours last week surrounding the winter fuel payment announcement, they should have learned a lesson. Therefore, I suspect I was not the only MSP angered to read in the Daily Record that the Scottish Government is set to embarrassingly U-turn on the cuts to affordable housing in today's budget statement. The article was published at 4:30 this morning, and it appears to me that this has been leaked to the media before MSPs have had the opportunity to listen and to scrutinise the Scottish Government's proposals. The Daily Record must be the SNP's favourite paper or choice of paper this season, and I do find it almost suspicious that both leaks have been handed to the same paper. The SNP government should not be utilising the press to try and claw back any shred of credibility that they lost when they brutally cut this vital fund. If they believe that this is clever politics, they are clearly mistaken. It's disrespectful to you as the presiding officer, backbench SNP MSPs and opposition members in this place. Presiding Officer, this is becoming commonplace that the SNP believe that they are above any convention and processes of this Parliament. Therefore, will you seek to investigate this matter, to ascertain how this information managed to find its way into mainstream press before the ministerial statement on the Scottish budget this afternoon? Can I ask what repercussions of this disrespectful behaviour will be, and should the statement be rewritten to reflect what we already know and what has been available in the public domain for nearly 9 hours?
Thank you, Ms Gallagher. I can confirm that I have not seen the statement and therefore cannot comment on what is in it and what is not in it and how that relates to what is in the press. We now move to portfolio questions. The first portfolio is Constitution, External Affairs and Culture and Parliamentary Business. As members will appreciate, we are tight for time across a busy afternoon, and therefore I would appeal for succinct questions and indeed responses. Any member wishing to ask a supplementary question should press the request to speak buttons during the relevant question, and I call question number 1, Tess White.
To ask the Scottish Government when it expects its preparatory work to conclude and review into Creative Scotland, which was announced in September 2024, to get underway.
Cabinet Secretary Angus Robertson.
May I begin by extending congratulations to the Scottish artist Jasleen Kaur for winning the Turner Prize 2024, and note how she said that an inspiring schoolteacher and funding from the Scottish Government made it possible for her to train as an artist. I'm sure we all across the parties wish her well. In answer to Tess White's question, I recognise that it's essential that the culture sector has had an opportunity to engage in this work, and I can confirm that this engagement will begin early next year with a short survey about the scope of the review. The Scottish Government will aim to announce the independent chair of the Creative Scotland Review shortly, and will aim for them to publish their recommendations by summer 2025.
Tess White.
Cabinet Secretary. Gender-critical author Jenny Lindsay wrote in her latest book, Hounded, that in a democracy, no person or group should be permitted to force their own subjective beliefs on those who take a contrary position. And yet that's precisely what Creative Scotland did when a member of staff tried to prevent Miss Lindsay from being stocked by bookshops because she was wrongly deemed to be transphobic. It was cultural authoritarianism at its worst. The planned review into Creative Scotland is welcome, but can the Cabinet Secretary provide assurances that the process will look at the importance of protecting free speech for authors and artists who seek support for their work from a public body?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I thank Tess White for her welcome for the review, and say to her, as I said to other colleagues in previous portfolio questions, that I look forward to the independent chair of the Creative Scotland Review being able to get on with the review independently. I'm sure that person, when they take up office and when we announce that, will have listened very closely to what MSPs of all parties have said in terms of issues which they consider the review should look at. And I don't think it's for me to suggest what is on and off the table for an independent chair of a review to take seriously. And I'm sure Tess White will wish to raise that directly with them when they are announced.
Question 2, Patrick Harvey.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government how the planned review of Creative Scotland will improve compliance with fair work principles in the culture sector.
Cabinet Secretary.
The review of Creative Scotland is a necessary part of a wider piece of work to maximise the impact of public funding, and it's our belief that public sector funding should lever in wider societal benefits, such as the promotion of fair work, in order to support the development of a sustainable and successful well-being economy over the long term that is fair, that is green and is growing. And the Fair Work Task Force is due to present its recommendations in June 2025, and this will allow them to be considered during the course of the review.
Patrick Harvey.
Both the review and the trajectory toward £100 million of additional culture funding offers a huge opportunity to improve much about the culture sector. And instead of dragging the sector into Tory transphobic culture wars, addressing issues like fair work would be a far more practical benefit in a sector in which casual labour and freelance work is pretty much endemic. Will the Cabinet Secretary ensure that fair work principles are addressed specifically in the remit of the review? Will they ensure that the unions that represent casual and freelance workers, both creatives and on the hospitality side of the culture sector, are represented as well?
Cabinet Secretary.
As I'm sure Patrick Harvey would expect, I meet regularly with the trades unions in the culture and arts sector, and did so, I think I'm right in saying, only last week. The issue of fair work was at the top of the agenda of our conversations, and as I said to them, I'll say to Mr Harvey now, I would expect this and other issues to be considered by the review, and in the meantime the Scottish Government will continue working through the task force to make sure that we are considering all deliverables that the Scottish Government has a part in playing to ensure that fair work is respected right across the culture and arts sector.
And we supplementary, Neil Bibby.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I join the Cabinet Secretary in congratulating Jaslene Kaur on winning the Turner Prize. Analysis of Creative Scotland's published accounts from 2022-23 shows that the percentage of its budget reaching the pockets of frontline creatives in 2022-23 fell to 83%, compared with 92% in the 2 previous years. In terms of achieving fair work, does the Cabinet Secretary agree that a greater proportion of Creative Scotland's budget should be used to put money in the pockets of frontline creatives, and will that be considered as part of the review alongside Mr Harvey's sensible suggestions?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would like to give Neil Bibby the same assurance that I've given to colleagues in other political parties in portfolio questions already. I am really keen for this independent review of Creative Scotland, which will have to consider the wider arts and culture sector, and not just that which is directly or indirectly funded by Creative Scotland, that it would consider all of the options that are relevant to people in the sector. That's why there will be an invitation extended to the sector to raise issues, needs, interests, concerns, expectations, and that is also what I expect members of all parties and parties themselves to be able to play an active role. I give him a commitment that fair work is very high on my agenda, and I believe that the review will form a part of us being able to make sure that we are able to deliver everything that we possibly can to make sure that people are on firm financial footings working in the arts and culture sector.
Thank you. Question 3, Claire Adamson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what impact it anticipates that the UK Government's decision to raise employer national insurance contributions will have on organisations in the culture sector that are in receipt of Scottish Government funding.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the increased costs to the sector introduced by the UK Labour Government could see a reduction in employment, a reduction in wages or a reduction in services. And the Scottish Government is committed to investing at least £100 million more annually in culture and the arts by 28-29. It's disappointing that the UK Government has chosen to erode the benefits of this. We're clear that the UK Government should have asked those with the broadest shoulders to contribute more, not try and balance their budget on the back of cultural organisations, charities and the health service.
Claire Adamson.
Cabinet Secretary for his answers. In recent years, UK Government funding available for culture sector has decreased. Grant and aid funding for UK arts and cultural organisations fell by 18% between 2010 and 2012.
2023. Thousands of charities and cultural organisations have warned that they will now have to absorb these costs. What impact does the Cabinet Secretary think that this will have on the long-term sustainability of culture in Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I recognise that the sector is hugely concerned about public funding for culture and about what the immediate and longer-term future holds. It's not right that these organisations should be disadvantaged by the UK Government's policy change, and there's a significant uncertainty about whether the costs of the changes to national insurance contributions will be adequately and properly covered by the UK Government, and that will be the subject of detailed discussions between the Scottish Government and the UK Government as we proceed with our budget steps.
And supplementary, Pam Gossel.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I would also like to join the Cabinet Secretary in congratulating Jaslene Kaur in winning the Turner Prize. The Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations estimate national insurance contribution changes will have a cumulative cost of £75 million to the third sector in Scotland. Considering that charities and third sector play such a critical role in promoting Scotland, what guarantees will the Cabinet Secretary give to ensure that these vital employers are not subject to further in-year cuts from the Scottish Government?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Presiding Officer, I think we're talking about national insurance contributions and the UK Government's announcement in terms of my answer, and Pam Gossel is absolutely right to highlight that this will have an impact in the third sector and in culture and the arts. And we will do everything in our communications with the UK Government to stress how it is for them to ameliorate these problems. The Scottish Government's job is not to make good on bad decisions by the UK Government. Our job is to use our powers in the devolved areas of responsibility to deliver certainty and growth. We're going to try and do as much of that as we possibly can, but having decisions, as we've seen from the UK Government on national insurance contributions being as detrimental as they are, we're going to have to persuade the UK Government to make good on this damaging decision.
Question 4, Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what discussions the Culture Secretary has had with the Finance Secretary regarding whether it will deliver its commitment to provide an additional £25 million to the culture sector in 2025-26.
Cabinet Secretary.
I've had regular discussions with the Cabinet Secretary for Finance regarding the aim for a further £25 million in the next financial year as part of the commitment to an additional £100 million per year by 28-29. I look forward to setting out further details of the culture funding for next financial year in the coming days once the Scottish Government budget has been published later this afternoon.
Mark Griffin.
Cabinet Secretary, the culture sector has faced a double whammy of broken promises and underfunding, and that's been compounded by local authority budget cuts that have stripped over £163 million from culture and heritage budgets since 2011-12. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he'll commit not only to talking to the Finance Secretary about that promised £25 million, but also to secure a fair funding settlement for local governments to start to reverse those culture cuts that have hit our communities?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think Mark Griffin asks important questions just ahead of the budget, so he's just going to have to be a little bit patient. I note what he's had to say about local government finance. I note what he's had to say in relation to the Labour Party's hope that we raise spending by £25 million, one echoed by the Scottish Music Industry Association. Let's see what comes up in the budget later this afternoon. Then I'll be happy to have further conversations with him if he likes.
And supplementary, Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Increased cultural funding has the welcome potential to improve and flourish the arts in Scotland. So what steps will the Scottish Government take alongside any funding increase to ensure that it is not wasted? And what will the Cabinet Secretary do to ensure that projected funds through any uplift are an appropriate use of taxpayers' money?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I give Alexander Stewart the assurance there's a lot of thought that goes in, particularly at this time of year, to making sure that we can maximise the funding, and you would expect the Culture Secretary to have impressed on colleagues why I believe it's important to have the appropriate funding in place. The conversations that take place with organisations, whether that's funding bodies like Creative Scotland or indeed the national performing companies who I met earlier today, revolve very extensively around the best use of taxpayers' money to make sure that we're supporting culture and the arts in the best way possible. If he has any particular views, I would urge him to feed that into the Creative Scotland review process, and I'm sure it will be taken very seriously.
Thank you. Question 5, Ariane Burgess.
To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the recent reaffirmation of its commitment to increase culture funding by at least an additional £100 million a year by 2028 to 29. How much of this extra investment will be directed towards community arts and placemaking?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think I'd be in trouble, presiding officer, if I was to preview what we're about to hear in the budget. So I'll rest on the point that once the Scottish Government budget has been published later this afternoon, I'll set out further details on funding for specific areas of the culture sector, and we're happy to share that with Ariane Burgess.
Ariane Burgess.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Community arts organisations in my region, such as Findhorn Bay Arts, Dunoon Pop Shop and Anlantyre in Stornoway, play a key role in placemaking, but due to a lack of a clear route map for this kind of funding and a current low levels of funding relative to other European nations, organisations around the country are worried about how secure this £100 million pledge is. And they've set up the Invest in Culture campaign, I'm sure you're aware of that, to highlight the value of the culture sector and raise their concerns. What route map does the Government have for funding community arts and placemaking?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I would strongly urge Ariane Burgess to remain seated where she is and wait for the budget, and I'm sure she will hear much more about this subject. Just in passing, I would like to put on record my appreciation both to Findhorn Arts and many of the arts and cultural organisations that emanate from Universal Hall and from Findhorn more generally. I speak as a former Member of Parliament for Murray. I know how talented the arts organisations there are, that are based there. I am a big fan of community arts projects, but again, I would be in breach of protocols by giving previews of what's in the budget, and I would encourage Ariane Burgess to remain in her seat to listen to those details later.
A couple of supplementaries. First, Gordon MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Labour have cut in real terms the culture resource funding in England, with the Department of Culture, Media and Sport seeing an average 2.5% cut in day-to-day spending between 23-24 and 25-26. Given the concerns that have been raised by those in the culture sector, can the Cabinet Secretary outline how this contrasts with the approach being taken by the Scottish Government and the steps it will continue to take to support community arts?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Gordon MacDonald is absolutely right to highlight the fact that the UK Labour government is cutting revenue funding through the DCMS for the culture sector in England. Worth also putting on note that the Labour government in Wales is also cutting culture funding, whereas in Scotland spending is up. Let me assure Mr MacDonald that I am committed to supporting arts and culture within the community, and I know firsthand how important this is. After the publication of the Scottish budget this afternoon, I'll be happy to set out in more detail how we will continue to support community arts.
Faisal Chowdhury.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Macmillan Hub in Muirhouse, North Edinburgh, will be fully reopening in January. This project, completed with support from the Scottish Government and others, will include a 96-seat theatre, social enterprise cafe, artist studios and a council library. A great example of local culture benefiting all. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise if the Scottish Government would consider working with the Brunton Theatre Trust in similar effort to replace the Brunton Theatre in Musselburgh, which was recently forced to close?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, can I very much welcome the question that Faisal Chowdhury has posed and the way in which he has done that. I've already given commitments to the constituency member representing the theatre in Musselburgh. I'm delighted to hear about the progress that's been made in Muirhouse, and if there's anything more that I can do to support either of those organisations and venues, I am open to doing so.
Thank you. Question 6, Alec Rowley.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on what it can do to support access to library services in rural areas.
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Alec Rowley for his question. Public libraries are devolved to local authorities. They have a statutory duty to secure the provision of adequate library facilities in their area. We encourage library usage through our support for the Scottish Library and Information Council. This includes £450,000 for the Public Library Improvement Fund, which supports creative, sustainable and innovative public library projects throughout Scotland and is on top of our general revenue funding to local authorities.
Alec Rowley.
Thank you. The Cabinet Secretary may well be aware of the proposal to close a host of libraries, rural libraries across Perth and Kinross. This is a serious issue, and the case for libraries is well known and well made. But it is now run by Analio, and there is a complete democratic deficit there when communities are trying to campaign to save these libraries. Is there not a need for clearer guidance to be given to local authorities around the provision of rural libraries? And also, is there not a need for a review of the democratic deficit that has been created by, in effect, creating quangos to run these public services and indeed close these public services?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, as I'm sure Alec Rowley knows, I'm a big fan of libraries. I'm a big supporter of library provisions right across Scotland, whether in rural or in an urban setting. He raises an issue about democratic accountability and the decisions that are made at a local authority level. I'm perfectly content to have a look in relation to the question that he raises to me. I will endeavour to write back and reply to him, and anything that I can do to support and encourage colleagues in local authorities to protect and support the provision of library services, I will do so.
Supplementary, Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Members across this chamber, including Mr Rowley just now, have raised concern about the closure of libraries in Perth and Kinross, part of the region that both Mr Rowley and I represent. This is not isolated to Perth and Kinross. It's happening right across the country, where councils are looking to close libraries due to cost pressures. Now, I welcome what the Cabinet Secretary had to say about the value of libraries. Isn't it time for a proper national strategy to protect the availability of local libraries, given their importance to the community? And isn't it time the Scottish Government properly funded local councils to make sure they could stay open?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, firstly, on local government finance, again, I'm sure he'll be listening very closely to the budget later this afternoon. I'm open to all suggestions about making sure that Scotland, a country of libraries, is able to maintain the provision of service, the level of service which the public supports. And I appreciate there are cost pressures in local government. I appreciate that there are challenges, particularly in rural areas. I will look at the issue. I have given an undertaking to Alex Rowley that I will do that. I will happily share that with Murdo Fraser. I understand that a review has been undertaken in Perth and Kinross. No doubt Mr Fraser has made a submission to that. If he wants to forward his submission to me so that I understand better the challenges in Perth and Kinross, given how important it is, I'm sure he will have done that. I will look very closely at his submission to the review.
Thank you. Question 7, Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the work of Brand Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
Since Brand Scotland was established by the Scottish Government in 2018, it has gone from strength to strength and has evolved into a multi-award-winning nation brand. The cross-organisational partnership continues to play an instrumental role in improving Scotland's positive reputation abroad by building and maintaining strong relationships with other nations and attracting people to Scotland to live, to work, to study and do business. I'd like to extend my congratulations to the teams working across the Brand Scotland partnership on winning 5 awards this year, most recently the Nation Place Global Awards 2024, where they achieved the Best Communication Strategy.
Annabel Ewing.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his answer, and in fact, having had a look at the Brand Scotland website, I think that it is an excellent tool. However, I wonder what plans the Scottish Government has to ensure that more people, both at home and abroad, are aware of this comprehensive source of information about Scotland, and how local communities can ensure that their events are in fact referenced.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, may I commend Annabel Ewing for a supplementary question, as she raises the excellent opportunity that we all have to get behind the Brand Scotland partnership. For members who are not aware, they can, by visiting www.scotland.org, click on the link to the toolkit at the bottom of the landing page and access the amazing resources that there are to help promote whether it is our economy, our tourism economy, whether it is our universities, whether it is the food and drinks. These are all of the organisations that work in partnership as part of the Brand Scotland partnership, and I would hope, I would expect that colleagues from right across the chamber and all parties are using that resource to help promote Scotland at home and abroad. And of course, local communities are welcome to use the branding tools for their event promotion to help us showcase the beauty of Scotland to those who come to live, to work, to study, to visit and to do business.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Question 8 was not lodged. That concludes, therefore, portfolio questions on constitutional, external affairs and culture and parliamentary business. We will move straight on to portfolio questions on justice and home affairs. The same appeal as before. On a busy afternoon, I would appreciate succinct questions and responses. Any member wishing to ask a supplementary question should press the request to speak buttons during the relevant question. And I call question number 1, David Torrance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of it being the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, whether it will provide an update on what steps it is taking to tackle violence against women and girls.
Cabinet Secretary Angela Constance.
Presiding Officer, violence against women and girls is abhorrent. If we want to see a society free from violence, abuse and misogyny, we must prioritise addressing the root cause of that violence, gender inequality. Tackling gender-based violence is not just a commitment for 16 days, it is a commitment for 365 days. Working with a range of partners, we are implementing our ambitious and long-term Equally Safe strategy, which focuses on early intervention and prevention and is backed by an annual £19 million through the Delivering Equally Safe Fund, which supports 119 projects from more than 100 organisations.
David Torrance.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. Violence against women and girls is abhorrent, and frontline services provide much-needed support to victims and survivors. Can I ask the Scottish Government to outline what steps it is taking to ensure that victims get all the support they need?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, we are investing record levels of funding, including significant levels of funding into frontline services to support victims of violence, including through our Delivering the Equally Safe Fund and the Victim-Centred Approach Fund. Between October 2021 and March 2024, the Delivering Equally Safe Fund has supported 67,004 adults, children and young people. The stories of the transformative impact on their lives demonstrate the importance of this work, and our Victim-Centred Approach Fund will provide £48 million to 23 organisations between 2022 and 2025, including £18.5 million for specialist advocacy support for survivors of gender-based violence.
A couple of brief supplementaries. First, Pauline McNeill.
The Scottish Government regularly highlight their excellent Equally Safe at School project developed by Rape Crisis, and it's one of the key ways of tackling violence against women and girls at its root. But the Scottish Government reported that they expected that project to be running in around 48% of secondary schools by 2020. But 4 years later, in an answer to a parliamentary question I recently submitted, it seems that that's currently only 116 schools to have registered with Equally Safe, so that's less than 1/3 of secondary schools. So I ask the Cabinet Secretary if she will outline what action that they will take to ensure that all secondary schools are running a programme like this or a similar programme to tackle violence against women and girls
Cabinet
at its root.
Presiding Officer, Ms McNeill raises an important point around the efficacy of the Equally Safe programme within our schools. When I was the Social Justice Secretary, I attended the launch of that programme in a Lanarkshire school, and it is a matter in terms of the rollout of that programme. I know progress has been made, but nonetheless I will raise that with the Education Secretary and also the Cabinet Secretary for Social Justice, who has responsibility for this area.
And briefly, Ash Regan.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government's stated position in the Equally Safe strategy is that prostitution is violence against women. So, in the absence of a Scottish Government plan to challenge demand, will the Scottish Government do the right thing by Scotland's women and girls and back my unbuyable bill?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the member is quite correct. The commercial sexual exploitation of women is indeed a form of violence against women and girls, and the Scottish Government does have a programme of work that is its very core to both challenge and deter demand for that form of violence. I know that my colleague Ms Brown has met with Ms Regan and will continue to do so. It is important that this issue isn't considered in isolation and that we all get behind a collective endeavour.
Question 2, Eleanor Whittam.
To ask the Scottish Government what recent assessment it has made of how successful the Bella Centre in Dundee and Lilia Centre in Glasgow have been in acknowledging the experience of trauma and adversity in supporting successful transitions for women back into the community.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, community custody units represents a step change in the rehabilitation of women in custody. The units support women to develop key life skills and a greater degree of independence, giving them the best possible chance of a successful return to the community. And I welcome the Inspectorate's recent report on HMP YOI Stirling and the Lilias and Bella Centres, which found them to be safe, stable and in keeping with the trauma-informed ethos set out in the National Strategy for Women in Custody. The Inspectorate commended the units for their evident successful beginning and hailed them as a significant milestone on the Scottish Prison Service journey towards excellence.
Eleanor Whittam.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The Bella and Lilias community custody units are world-leading facilities and are the only one of their kind in the UK. And as such, they have rightly garnered both national and international interest. I myself was hugely impressed when I visited in my former ministerial role. I was so struck by the sense of calm and the psychologically informed design they embodied. I said at the time it felt more like a women's refuge than a custody setting. Will the Cabinet Secretary provide an update as to the continued assessment and evaluation of these centres moving forward to ensure their success in delivering a safe, stable and trauma-informed service, especially to those women who have experienced severe and multiple disadvantage?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I thank Ms Whittam for her continued interest, and I too am proud of what has been achieved by the introduction of the community custody units. The approach is founded on the principle that all aspects of the care of women in custody should be designed for women and take account of their likely experience of trauma and adversities. The University of Glasgow, Stirling and Cambridge have been commissioned to undertake an independent evaluation of the community custody units, and I very much look forward to considering their report in the spring.
Question 3, Gordon MacDonald.
To ask the Scottish Government how much money recovered from the proceeds of crime has been committed to the Cashback for Communities programme since 2008.
Minister Siobhan Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Since 2008, Cashback for Communities has committed £130 million of money recovered through the Proceeds of Crime Act to support around 1.3 million young people across all 32 local authorities in Scotland. Cashback-funded partners provide a spectrum of interventions which include providing safe spaces, trusted adults and a range of positive diversionary and support activity to both young people who may be at risk of entering the criminal justice system and communities impacted by crime. The programme delivers both national and local projects, with particular efforts made to work in the lowest 20% of SIMD areas to ensure equality of opportunities for our young people. This is reflected in the annual impact report, which will be published shortly.
Gordon MacDonald.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Cashback for Communities has invested £8.7 million into projects across Edinburgh since 2008, supporting 198,000 activities. Score Scotland, who are recipients of funding, deliver significant intervention work through their Youth Exchange project at Gate 55 in my constituency. The young people are driving change in their communities and influencing what happens through the Cashback for Communities programme, but can you advise how the effectiveness and impact of the programme funding will be evaluated?
Minister.
Thank you, and I think the member raises examples of some really great work that's happening in his constituency, and I'd urge all MSPs across the chamber to look at the cashback work going on in their own constituencies and pay a visit. But in saying that, the Scottish Government recognises the importance of transparency when it comes to evaluating the Cashback for Communities programme. The impact of the programme is evidenced in two ways. Each year, an impact report is published. This provides evidence of how cashback has positively impacted on young people's lives and provides the opportunity for young people to make their voices heard. In addition, an independent evaluation is commissioned to review the impact and value of each three-year phase of Cashback for Communities. We have appointed the Bean Research to evaluate phase 6 of the programme, and the evaluation will assess the effectiveness of the programme with a particular emphasis measuring and reporting social changes that the programme delivers.
I'll take a supplementary as long as it's brief in the response. Likewise, Sharon Dowie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The latest statistics reveal the scale of confiscation orders imposed on criminals but not yet paid. Around a quarter of those fines issued in 2020-21 remain unpaid and behind schedule, amounting to almost £500,000. The figures for 2022-23 aren't much better. In total, from the last 5 years, criminals subject to these orders are 1.7 million in arrears. money that could be benefiting communities and victims of crime. What is the Scottish Government doing to improve collection rates?
Minister.
Thank you, and I thank the member for that question. As you know, up to $20 million has been committed to phase 6 of the programme. The Scottish Government will always endeavour to do what we can to improve the collection of the proceeds of crime.
Thank you. Question 4, Annie Wells.
Thank you, President Officer. To ask the Scottish Government what measures it is taking to support the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service in advance of the winter months.
Minister.
Thank you. The Scottish Government supports the Scottish Fire Rescue Service to keep our communities safe every day of the year through its highly skilled crews, providing £393.3 million this year. SFRS is ready to respond to the range of challenges over winter, including severe weather and flooding, and they work closely with our other responders through resilience partnerships. As a national organisation, it can direct resources where they need it the most. SFRS will continue to issue public safety advice over winter with a particular focus on road and water safety in the event of severe weather. In parallel, the Scottish Government supports the service to undertake prevention activity through home fire safety visits to vulnerable people and winter safety campaigns.
Annie Wells.
I thank the Minister for that response. John Mackenzie, the Scottish Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, has recently warned that the service is in a deadly cycle of decline, with the number of engines being cut and funding so bad some stations don't even have running water. Can the Minister reassure our brave firefighters that the SNP Government will not perpetuate this deadly cycle of decline?
Minister.
Thank you. We do continue our commitment to support the Scottish Fire Rescue Service to deliver a high standard of services required to keep the whole of Scotland safe. As I said, in the 24-25 budget, there was £393.3 million, and that is £79 million more than it was back in 2017 to 18. Decisions on how this budget is spent is a matter for the SFRS board, and we will continue to work closely with the SFRS to identify funding needs.
And supplementary, Beatrice Wishart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm sorry, there's something wrong with the camera. I don't know what's wrong with it. I've got a blank screen. And I should, before I ask my question, declare that I have a family member who's a volunteer with the Scottish Fire and Rescue Service. Regional Secretary of the Fire Brigades Union, John Mackenzie, found that Shetland's Bressay Fire Station to be, and I quote, the worst station I've seen in 20 years. Works urgently needed to bring stations up to an acceptable standard for our emergency services crews. So in advance of the winter months, what will the Scottish Government do to ensure that the fire stations in Shetland will be supported and that the facilities receive urgent attention?
Minister.
Thank you. The safety and welfare of staff in SFRS continue to invest in the repair and the maintenance of its buildings so it can deliver services to communities across Scotland. I know that the SFRS does have a programme of fire station refurbishment where dignified facilities for all firefighters, along with proper separations of areas to avoid contamination, are both priorities. It's right and sensible for SFRS to consider where its assets should be based to ensure the right resources are in the right place to deal with the risks facing our communities. I'm happy to write to Beatrice Wishart specifically about the Shetland one.
Question 5, Carol Mochan.
To ask the Scottish Government what its response is to recent reports that many towns in Scotland are so-called legal aid deserts.
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The number of active legal aid solicitors has remained broadly similar in the years since 2020, and we are unaware of any accused being released as a result of being underrepresented. We acknowledge that there are challenges facing those seeking help in relation to certain types of cases in some places. However, we cannot compel private solicitors to undertake work. We recognise that reform is needed, and the Scottish Legal Aid Board are currently undertaking a comprehensive analysis to collect evidence of the degree of legal aid activity at a geographical and subject matter level. I've written to the Law Society and the Scottish Solicitors Bar Association to continue to work productively to identify measures to improve and reform Scotland's legal aid.
Carol Mochan.
Thank you. I thank the Minister for her response. Over recent years, legal aid organisations have called for serious reform, citing a system that has been left in a state of neglect. Their calls have been frustrated by a government that has failed to recognise the need for immediate action. In recognising the 16 days of activism against gender-based violence, does the Minister accept that a failure to deliver both short and longer-term reform to the legal aid system poses significant risks to vulnerable groups within our society, particularly victims of domestic abuse?
Minister.
Thank you. I do acknowledge, and I've been upfront with the parliamentary timetable, that it is unlikely that primary legislation and legal aid reform will happen this parliamentary term, but I am committed to making legal aid reform within the next 18 months. Legal aid needs to be better able to identify and anticipate the needs of service users, to allocate resources where they're most needed, and to ensure it is accessible, consistent, transparent, and has a clear focus on delivering policy objectives. This work is ongoing, and a paper is going to be published on legal aid reform imminently.
A couple of supplementaries. I'll get them both in if they are brief, and the responses likewise. First, Rona Mackay.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The significant changes were previously made in England and Wales, which reduced both the scope and resources for legal aid, compared with here in Scotland. Has the Minister considered replicating that, or does the Scottish Government believe free legal services should be available to those who are most in need?
Minister.
Thank you. Unlike England and Wales, where there have been significant cuts to legal aid scope and funding, we've maintained the scope and resourcing of legal aid. The expenditure for legal aid provides timescales as assumed. 2023 to 2024 was £151 million, which we know is demand-led. This was £10 million higher than the allocated budget, and this is a 12% increase on 22 to 23 and a 16% increase from 2019 to 2020. We do not intend to replicate the changes of the UK Government with reduced legal aid, but we do agree that an independent review of reform is needed.
And Liam Kerr.
Presiding Officer, one of the drivers of legal aid deserts is the decreasing number of legal aid criminal defence solicitors. The Legal Aid Trainee Fund is due to end in March 2025, and the Government says it's evaluating the scheme. So when will the Government conclude that evaluation, and when precisely can practices expect to know whether support from the fund will continue beyond March 25?
Minister.
Thank you. I think just regarding the numbers, I think some of the figures that have been in the local press do not take into account solicitors on joint duty plans, and additionally they do not include the publicly employed solicitors of public defence. Regarding the legal aid trainee fund, that is due to end in March 2025, and learning lessons from previous grant funding projects such as this is extremely important, and the outcome of the evaluation will help shape and inform any decisions with regard to the future traineeship. March 2025 is when it finishes, and then we will evaluate it.
Question 6, Alexander Stewart.
Officer, to ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on how it's working to clear the criminal court backlog.
Cabinet Secretary.
Officer, significant progress has been made reducing court backlogs. The number of scheduled trials has fallen by over 20,000 since January 2022, a reduction of over 48%. That trend continues, and we remain committed to supporting justice partners to drive reform to ensure our justice system works better for everyone. Summary case management provides a new approach to summary criminal cases, and digital evidence sharing capability, which allows digital evidence to be shared at the earliest opportunity, are examples of reform which aim to conclude cases quicker. This reduces the time which victims, witnesses and accused await their trial.
Alexander Stewart.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The recent analysis conducted by Public and Commercial Services Union found that 75% of Scottish Court and Tribunal Services staff felt that workload was impinging on their workload and effectiveness and successful delivery of justice. The problems caused in this justice system, in its crumbling and its widespread and its systemic, Cabinet Secretary. So what action will you take to support our staff in the court system to ensure that this long-running backlog is cleared?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I would also like to pay tribute to our very hard work in courts and tribunal staff. It is accurate for me to point out to the member that since 2021 this Government has invested £180 million into court recovery. It is true to say that our courts continue to be very busy, and the level of business has changed, and that the new baseline will be to get outstanding trials down to around 20,000.
Thank you. As the chamber fills, can I encourage members not to engage in private conversations while portfolio questions continues? I call question number 7, Sue Webber.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how it is working with Police Scotland to increase law enforcement resources in Scotland's cities.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the budget statement, which we will hear shortly, will include details on how we will continue to support our hard-working police officers to keep Scotland's communities safe. I can remind the member that in our 2024-25 budget, we provided record police funding of £1.55 billion. The Chief Constable confirmed this would allow her to maintain officer numbers at around 16,500 to 16,600, with 16,600 officers being reached on the 4th of November. However, it remains the case that the UK Government's austerity through the back door via the increase in employer national insurance contributions will cost our public services, and this could add around £500 million to public sector costs.
Sue Webber.
For that response. Edinburgh's population has grown over the past decade, and along with the complexities of policing the capital, this population growth has not been matched by a rise in divisional resources for Police Scotland, which has floated around 1,100 officers in Edinburgh for most of this year. Maintaining numbers is not enough for the city. I witnessed these pressures firsthand when I went out with officers from Wester Hailes Police Station in south west Edinburgh, and this strain became evident to all in the firework-related violence we saw last month. What action will the Cabinet Secretary take to ensure that Edinburgh has the policing resources that are fit for a capital and matches its growing population?
Okay, we have a little less background noise. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the population continues to increase, not just in the city of Edinburgh, but right across the Lothian region, including in my own Amond Valley constituency. And one of the benefits of having a national police resource is that resources can be deployed to where need is required. And I would like to put on record the very important point that the member raises that with regards to bonfire night this year, where one officer was injured and, however, someone was charged for that, and that was an improvement in the 62 injuries to police officers last year. But, of course, one injury is one too many.
Very brief supplementary. Ben McPherson.
As has been referenced, in Edinburgh this year, we have experienced some very dangerous, harmful, disruptive, antisocial behaviour undertaken in the main by a very small minority of young people. Therefore, I'd be grateful if the Cabinet Secretary could engage with Police Scotland partners and MSPs in 2025 to consider any further ways that we can address this together.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, yes, of course. And while decisions on the deployment of resources are for the Chief Constable, as of 30th of September, Edinburgh's E-Division had over 1,100 officers deployed across the city, a small increase on the previous quarter. And also the Independent Working Group on Antisocial Behaviour will report to Ministers COSLA and Police Scotland by the end of 2024, ahead of publication, and I look forward to reading and discussing its findings and recommendations, and I'll keep the member informed.
And question 8, Claire Hawley.
To ask the Scottish Government what discussions it has had with South Lanarkshire Council regarding potential firework control zones in the local authority area.
Minister.
The 2022 Fireworks Act gave local authorities powers to designate firework control zones. It is for them to decide how they use those powers, and Edinburgh did this year designate 4 zones. Statutory guidance is available to support local authorities, and the Scottish Government has made funding available for consulting on and implementing the zones. South Lanarkshire Council has not requested any of this funding or approached my officials about the possibility of doing so. More broadly, I recognise the nature of problems caused by fireworks, and I have written to the UK Government asking for a meeting to discuss what more can be done on fireworks regulation.
Claire Hawley.
I thank the Minister for that answer. Glasgow City Council offers the option for community requests to be made online for the firework control zone consideration. Yet South Lanarkshire Council has no information about the process on their website. Groups in my Rutherglen constituency are interested to learn more about making a community request. So can the Minister shed more light on the process and encourage local authorities to share information locally on how to make community requests?
Minister.
Firework Control Zone statutory guidance, which was jointly developed with COSLA, was issued in June 2023, and it makes clear that local authorities should, where possible, establish a local process to give communities the ability to make the case for the designation of firework control zones through a community request. The format and the detail of the community request process will be determined by each local authority, and I repeat the encouragement I've given previously to all local authorities to establish published and accessible details about community request processes. And I hope the information I've provided is helpful for the members' ongoing engagement with Lanarkshire Council in this regard.
Katie Clark.
What discussions has the Scottish Government had with councils implemented firework control zones in this first year? And will the Minister undertake to provide a full report to this Parliament, who spent a great deal of time scrutinising the legislation, on the operation and effectiveness of control zones and what lessons can be learnt?
And as briefly as possible, Minister.
I have had a briefing with Police and Scottish Fire Rescue in light after Bonfire Night and the firework control zones. I have not engaged with Edinburgh Council yet, but I will be doing so, and I'm happy to report back to the member.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes portfolio questions on justice and home affairs. There will be a brief pause before we move to the next item of business to allow front benches to change.